people will join, and it's being recorded. What about now?
No, I think you have to. You have to actually put our videos on.
Okay, I'm going to stop. Give the hosting duties.
Here we go. Perfect. Yeah, I think we can start.
I've also taken host back, so you're good to start, and I've got hosting control.
Perfect. Yeah, welcome everyone, and thanks for amazing panelists. I'll let you all introduce yourself in a second. I just wanted to say a word about what this is and what we're trying to do. So as Venture ESG and with Venture ESG, we're in the end an organization of VCs for VCs trying to think through and equip people with the necessary means to integrate ESG across their investment value chain. This very much starts with investment decision-making, how you run your own fund, what we call internal fund management, and how you support your portfolio companies. This is a reasonably new topic. We've started bringing people together and curating different types of resources almost 2 years ago now. And what we're trying to do is have conversations like this, where we're speaking with and about markets, issues, problems, opportunities, which aren't covered by normal ESG talk. And crypto is absolutely one of those. You will be very hard pressed to find an ESG framework which has specific questions about crypto. And that's what we're going to do research on in the aftermath of this conversation. So it now turns out to be the kickoff conversation to what is going to be a research project. And again, very, very lucky to have a fantastic panel of people here who all have different, and this is exactly how this came about, viewpoints on the E, S, and G of blockchain, crypto, and Web3. And again, do please introduce yourselves, perhaps starting with Brindley, Sarah, Ed, and Slobodan, before we dive into some questions. Spend about 30 to 40 minutes on that, and then have time for broader conversation, including the audience. So whenever you do think of something that you would like to ask, dear people listening in, drop it in the Q&A, and we'll either get to it in our conversation or definitely we'll have time at the end. Brindley, do you want to start?
Of course, thank you. Hello, everyone. So I am Brindley Lear. I am the head of blockchain and digital assets at the World Economic Forum, and I lead a crypto impact sustainability accelerator that is specifically focused on exploring E, S, and G in the crypto space. We have a number of initiatives right now. Under the E pillar, we have a sustainability coalition that's looking at energy usage, carbon credits, and Web3 climate solutions. Under the S pillar, we're doing ethnographic research in various areas, and in G, we're doing more academic research into DAOs and now identity. So in my work, I've been a lawyer in the space for quite a while. In my work at the forum, we're really focused on crypto and E, S, and G specifically.
Sarah, you want to go next?
Yeah, of course. I'm Sarah. Apologies, I have a cold. And I am a long-term community builder and angel investor. I spent a couple of years at a media network in California working to lead a team focused on responsible technology. So much of my work on that team focused on a couple of passions I have for decentralization and collective ownership. And, digital identity, data interoperability, and that really brought me back to Web3 a couple of years ago. I'd been around Bitcoin a bit early on, but found some of the politics of that era not to my taste. As an angel, I've backed a number of companies, and I'm particularly interested in and contributing to a number of DAOs. I've consulted and advised organizations like Filecoin and Gitcoin. I'm doing some work right now with Ceramic around portability of identity, which I find particularly interesting. And I think this question around ESG, I'm particularly fascinated by the G aspect, looking at FTX, SBF, lack of boards, that kind of thing, and look forward to learning from other panelists that are more experienced than me. Thank you.
Ed, Slobodan, to finish?
Sure. Hey, all, I'm Ed. I am an investor at Allegory, which is a venture firm investing and building at the intersection of climate and Web3. Which has me often then focus on the E and the G, and serve as a board chair for the Climate Collective, which is an innovation network that supports companies building at the intersection of climate impact and Web3. Climate Collective has a little over 20 members right now as part of its platform, thinking about public goods that the industry needs to be successful. And through Allegory, I've made investments in about 50 companies that are thinking about ways to leverage kind of a suite of Web3 technologies and innovations for climate impact.
Great. Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Slobodan. I'm an economist by training, worked in finance and research, and then worked for a few years as a consultant on the regulatory, antitrust, and market design issues, and then joined C Labs, which is a developer studio and incubator with focus on the cellular blockchain ecosystem. At C Labs, I worked on a range of topics from general protocol economics to stable coins, and also climate finance and carbon markets in particular. Excited to be here and great to see some familiar faces on the panel as well.
Yeah, very excited to have you all. And again, this panel was put together specifically to think about the E, and there's an oversubscription here on the E. We'll get to that in a section. The S and the G of ESG. But what we've been struggling with, and I've met many of you and I've interviewed many of you for a project that I've been doing with a colleague of mine in the US on values and ideologies and tensions in the crypto land. And what we are now actually going to do in that project, and what I want to start with here is, let's just talk about what we're even meaning when we say crypto, Web3, blockchain. So what is it that we're discussing today before we're diving into the E, the S, and the G, and one after the other? Perhaps Sarah, what is Web3 crypto? Touch on whatever you want to touch on. Name your name.
I can't believe you're asking me this question first. Yeah, I think I personally don't use the term crypto. I prefer Web3. And I think I said this to somebody the other day and they said, that sounds like something from the FT. You can't use this. But to me, Web3 is a certain set of ideologies backed by technology. I think in every wave of technology, there are powerful ideas that we hold up that speak to what this thing is and can be. And, if I think about Web3 at heart, for me, is a set of innovations enabled by the technology unlock of blockchain, the governance unlock of blockchain, the business model unlock of blockchain. And so because my interest is mostly in decentralization and collective ownership, that to me is uniquely enabled by the capabilities of this mechanism for building companies. But having said that, I have more than one Web2 investment that I think has a set of Web3 ideologies at their heart. I suspect a lot of these, and I think to your point at the beginning of the question, there are a lot of tensions between what I mean by Web3 and what others in the space mean by Web3. And I think there's a really interesting reckoning happening right now between these different forces kind of battling out. I tend to lean towards the kind of regen, solar punky public goods side of the space. Those are the communities that I'm in. And then when you see these massive blow-ups of organizations that you just have no interaction with in the press, that colors, particularly as someone who's co-investing a lot. There's a particular deal that I'm doing right now where a more generalist investor is pulling out because of their nervousness about the entire space. Whereas I would argue now is the time to really get tight on exactly, how we build companies wisely, how we build projects and companies wisely and well. But that's the best definition I've come to of how I think about projects in this area, like what Web3 means to me. To me, it's a fundamental digital renaissance enabled by this innovation in technology. But I'd be very curious about others on the panel, how they would define it. Because I just personally don't use the word crypto. That doesn't really resonate with me personally.
Does anyone want to jump in and talk about either blockchain or crypto to have a slightly different view on this?
Yeah, I really love that definition. And I do think that we are due for a rebrand in the space, because I think there is so much more happening than simply crypto, which I think talks about the tokens that are traded and mostly for speculation. There's so much more here. I love your definition. If I were going to add to it, it is this ethos of individual engagement and that decentralization aspect, this idea that you can engage with products that can be built anywhere on this open platform. I really love this idea of a digital good and public commons aspect of blockchains, and this idea that you can own both your identity, your experience, and your engagement, which is very different from Web 2. But those are the areas that I think are very exciting.
Yeah, I mean, I'll add to that because I agree. I prefer Web3 is people often ask like, well, what does the 3 mean? Like what was 2, what was 1? And to me, it's just a natural expansion essentially of like the decentralization opportunities of the internet. And so Web 1 was really more like it was one to many. So people could read and ingest content. Web 2, which we think about as like the last era of the Facebooks and Instagrams, was read and write. So you could read content, you could write content, you could post your own blog, but often you didn't own it, right? It was owned by other companies, and that's how they made money. Web 3 is read, write, own, right? Where suddenly every user has the ability not only to write and to read, but also to own the content that they create. And that vision of an internet where users are in control of their own data, where applications are built in like open, decentralized networks instead of centralized servers, is to me how people start envisioning new financial systems, new mechanisms to actually shape how we think about markets and goods. And there is, I think, even outside of the solar punk ethos that Sarah mentioned, this ethos across Web3 of evolving what we think our economy, what the world should look like. And all the technologies that support that sort of fit under that fold, with crypto just being one.
So that is immediately taking us to one of the tensions, right? And Reason have a very, very clever solution to this, which they call progressive decentralization. But if you then talk to people about this ideal state, which in a sense you, in various different ways, now put at the core of what Web3 is about, namely ideologies that often involve a strong element of decentralization. I'm going to not give you a loaded question, but ask you, and how many projects do you feel have reached this point of decentralization right now, percentage-wise?
I worked closely with Protocol Labs and Filecoin last year as they began this process. And I would say this is just a very new way of company building. If you think about the norms of how we build companies and startups, you know, we've had a set of norms in place for maybe 30 years around startups and venture capital, and this idea of building, this idea of hierarchy. And I think, you know, we're still learning. I think the progressive decentralization matrix to me makes a lot of sense. Like naturally at the start of a project, you need to have some sense of stewardship. You need to have some sense of direction. And often you cannot expect that to be shared with 1,000 people. You know, I've been part of a couple of projects that have decentralized effectively. I think it just takes time. It takes incredible over communication. And I think it takes space to understand what a good outcome looks like. And I think one of the core tensions of this space, and I'd be curious for the VCs on the panel to talk about this, the VC on the panel to talk about this, is there is this tension between how VCs have traditionally funded companies, where it's been like a VC founder relationship, and now you're finding it's a, you know, the yield merit example from earlier this year, where, you know, a particular DAO basically voted in their governance forum to kick the seed investor off the cap table because they felt they hadn't added value. And the seed investor came in and said, well, first of all, that's not how term sheets work. You can't do that. And so then they ended up in this really uncomfortable place where the governance forum hit the limits of their ability to govern. And the VC firm hit the limits of, you know, they can't really control that reputational damage, despite the fact that a lot of the community didn't really, as far as I can read from the outside, understand what was happening between them and the founder. I think this tension around control and perceived control is actually really interesting. And I'm part of well-run decentralized projects, and I'm part of a couple of very badly run ones. And it's, you know, I think we're still learning and building the muscle of how we do this well.
I agree that we are building the muscle of how we do this. It is entirely new. And I think most of the the change and the progress really needs to be on the human side, because we need to figure out how we engage with this technology that holds us accountable for certain things. I mean, if we look at democratic systems, it's not like we've mastered it and we're all going to vote and engage, right? So this really is a new system. In terms of what is decentralized, I really think about it from something of a legal perspective, because that's my training. When I think about a traditional organization that is, you know, like a Facebook or a Google, when they want to push out a technology change, they can do it. They can do it very quickly. It's centralized. They can make the decision and roll it out. Anytime that a decision has to be voted on by a community or updated through validators, you're dealing with a decentralized system. If you cannot move quickly, that suggests to me that you have levels of decentralization And I think that, is there a right amount of decentralization that is, what we should aspire to? I think it depends on the project, but I think any time that you cannot immediately put a code into place as you want it, you're dealing with a decentralized system.
I think that's like,
that's
sorry.
I'm sorry.
No, I think that's really a great point that you just made, Brinley. I think decentralization has kind of different meanings, and it depends a little bit on how you look at it. Let's say you have like a right that runs in itself autonomously on like self-executing smart contracts in some way or the other. That sounds to me very decentralized. But what if that protocol tries to purchase some real world asset, for example? Suddenly you need like to attach some type of like real world entity to the protocol. And then suddenly what is like decentralized in this Web3 space is not so decentralized anymore when it touches like the rest of the world, essentially. So it kind of really depends on like how narrow you view the scope, essentially, of when you talk about like decentralization.
I agree. I mean, I think, it's interesting when you talk about systemic change, you first really need to understand, how and why our existing systems work and how to solve the little problems along the way for specific customers with specific solutions. And I think often Web3 headlines distract us with kind of a lot of kind of ostentatious marketing and kind of crypto schemes. But underneath that are a lot of people trying to understand why our systems work as they do and how to make them better. And I think there's a necessary tension between understanding how systems work and making them better and making money that are hard to resolve when you do it all at once. And I mean, that's where organizations like the World Economic Forum come in, right? And unpack essentially all the different perspectives that we have to take into account before we make big changes. And so I do think in this model, I mean, the hardest thing for me to resolve as an investor is when to embrace innovation that breaks things and when to push back. And so we need to go slower and respect systems that have been built because they've learned lessons the hard way, and we need to take those into account.
But so one more pointed follow-on question: how many users of the millions that are interacting with what is called Web3 or crypto right now actually interact with decentralized systems, rather than with FTX, which is everything but a decentralized system, or the equivalence thereof, i.e., what we're talking about is possibly the infrastructure that nobody will ultimately ever really get to see, apart from the developers and the people investing in those. And that is also what is the worthwhile part of this all, while what we have been seeing in the media and what we are seeing melt down at the moment is not really that. It isn't really even decentralized Web3. It plays around with it a little bit, but it doesn't really do that. It just allows you to access something, namely cryptocurrencies and NFTs and other ways that are assets that people buy and sell. Is that fair?
I would love to answer that. I mean, I don't have a number of how many people engage with centralized exchanges versus decentralized systems, but I can speak to some of our research of what we are learning from communities. And I would say in this area, what we are finding from our on-the-ground research and talking with communities that are interested in Web3, it is that decentralization, it is that own your own asset and identity, it is that Web3 ethos that is exciting and is pulling people in. But that move from having that excitement around decentralized systems and being able to engage in decentralized systems, that is an education gap. And what we are finding is where you have adoption, you have this community push to educate each other and incubators and things like that. But we don't move to that engagement into decentralized systems, even though that is the spark that gets many people interested, until we have good usable systems. We really work on usability and good products that make sense and can reach people where they are, and education. But you know what, I just want to underscore here, this is around development and developing good products, because I think the interest is there. It's that decentralized aspect that is exciting. but it is too hard to use many times.
And I think also, you know, exchanges naturally tend to centralize because of what they do as a business, right? If you look at, you know, to Brittany's point around the use case, if you look at like AWS versus IPFS and Filecoin, you know, logically, AWS, not only do they have some really complicated labor rights stuff that means I don't like to give them my money, but they have a single point of failure in their system. You know, if you look at IPFS and Filecoin, just an incredibly clear use case in terms of decentralized storage, where it's very much more resilient as a system. You know, I do want to echo that point around simple UX. I have this really strong memory of minting my first NFT a couple of years ago. I'm not very into NFTs as a whole, but it was like a 35-step process. And my friend had to get on Zoom and like walk me through it. This is like the depths of the first lockdown. And I've been working in tech for quite a long time. And so I think, you know, I think so many of the ways that we reach the mass market will come from great UX, but also playing. I think that's how you get the mass of kind of customers kind of excited about a new way of doing things. You know, I think this notion of owning data is actually really compelling. You know, looking at friends who have very large Instagram followings, seeing how unhappy they are with every single algorithmic change. I think there's a lot more sophistication now in the everyday consumer's mindset around, you know, not my land, you know, don't own my, you know, I might have X thousand followers on Twitter, but if Elon Musk buys it tomorrow, I don't own that. I can't take that with me. And I think it's those kind of use cases, you know, and other innovations like ChatGPT, that to me tells me that Google search is back on the table. You know, I think there are all kinds of innovative shifts happening right now that remind me that so much of the dominant architecture of the internet is not fixed. You know, if you're 23 years old now, if you're a Gen Z, Twitter's been around since you're in nursery. You know, Facebook has been around since your parents were first dating. All these products that to me came into being when I was a grown-up. If you're younger, you're like, oh God, this is so boring and awful. I think for me, one of the biggest signals in Web3 of why I'm excited by it is the quality and energy of folks building in this space.
I think going back to the example of exchanges, it reminded me of an article that was published in the Economist, I think this week, by the founder of Uniswap, one of the largest decentralized exchanges, essentially. And I think he made like a very interesting point, essentially, like if we compare FTX to like a decentralized exchange, a lot of the problems that happen at FTX around like governance and transparency arguably could not have happened, right, on a decentralized exchange. And sure, I mean, how many people are using it? I mean, Uniswap probably has around 20 or 30 billion in terms of volume per quarter. So compared to like the bigger financial markets, it's peanuts for sure, but it's also not such a small number. So I think it's like, it's being used. Sure, like it's at some points nightmarish to use and there's room for improvement for sure. But it's actually one use case where I think you actually see like people actually using it and kind of also perceiving the value that it provides.
You touched on what I didn't want to touch on for a moment, which is the governance problem. So I think we'll roll the elephant up from the tail, so to speak, and start with the G. You will have all heard about FTX, which is only one of the cases where these types of issues came up, even just this year. Arguably, this element of decentralization, centralization is always actually in one direction in all of the cases. And you just said this, Lodan, where an implosion happened, be it FTX, Luna, Voyager, 3AC, and some of them were connected. Just today, there was a whole article in the New York Times about how possibly the whole Luna and FTX implosion were connected in a way that we hadn't really heard about, or I hadn't really heard about before. And perhaps, Brinley, from your lawyer's governance head, is this an issue that the real Web3, as we just talked about it in this decentralized way, is not going to have anymore because it's built in to not be centralized and have the type of governance issue that we've now been observing, leading to enormous problems and billions of everyday person's money being banned? Or is there other problems that come with that model? So talk us a little bit through the G of the ESG in this space.
Yeah, I guess the first point is corporate control problems are not new, and they're not new to this space. And where you don't have adequate corporate controls, you will not adequately identify, assess risk, or address potential conflicts of interest. So I would say just at the outset, let's just separate problematic corporate controls with the technology. I think one thing that is really interesting that is built into the technology is its transparency. And so if we think that part of a corporate control challenge is not being able to see what a corporation or entity is doing, in some ways you can address that through open, transparent blockchains. Does it solve all problems? Of course not. It will introduce new problems. But in terms of, if we want to say that part of the issue is transparency, I think the technology can do quite a bit to address that. But we still need to think about adequate regulation in this space. I feel like I've sort of glossed over your question without really answering it, because I think the answer is quite hard, and I'd be curious what others say about it.
Well, I've just watched the WeWork TV show, so I want to echo that point around Web 2 got this wrong in so many ways. Zuckerberg's double stock voting rights. I think when I think about what a better internet needs, we need systems of accountability for how corporates behave, and that can't just be self-governance. So I want to echo that point. We need smarter regulation. I'm in general very pro-regulation. I think we need to have the rails with which we can run. But I think secondly, because the space is so new, there hasn't really been, if I think about the really effective communities that I'm in where there's effective governance, that's because people have had the time to build up context. That's because there's a working muscle of how we make decisions as a group. It is a little bit different from a board. I'm on a couple of boards of Web 2 companies where it's a formal process of looking at the finances, looking at decisions made. And I think, if I think about the challenges of Web 2, and I worked in big tech when everything started going really wrong, so much of that was around speed of decision, lack of clarity in the context of decisions, especially American companies making choices that had complicated implications for the rest of the world. And I think there are some companies in Web3 that think deeply about this and get this right. I think Optimism are doing some really interesting work on governance right now that I would encourage folks to have a look at. But, I think when you have situations like FTX, where the sheer scale of money pouring in and you're realizing nobody asked for a board seat, despite that scale of funding, that makes me really, that to me is not a good sign for how this scene develops. We should want there to be accountability mechanisms, whether it's regulation at government level, whether it's boards at company level. I think for VC firms, because the funding market was so runaway for the last couple of years, what I've heard from friends in firms is they didn't feel comfortable pushing for a board seat because they knew they'd hear no. But I think as an angel, I have the joy of being neutral. I'm not a lead investor, therefore I can be quite close to the founders. And I think what I'm hearing from founders in the Web3 space is, they still have lots of questions. They want some governance, that they want that mechanism. And I really think as a community, we need to set our own best practices and be like, okay, particularly the number of, looking at every massive failure this year, for the most part, it was retail investors that lost money. And that is devastating. And that shouldn't be so. That has horrible implications for consumer trust and also for the whole scene in general. Like, if that kind of fraud can exist right under our noses, I think that's why neutral organizations like WEF can really push the scene forwards and kind of saying, okay, here's research, here's a playbook, here's what we recommend, in a way that I think Ventures ESG also, that's the role that you guys can play as well. I think it's very hard for an individual VC here. I think Andreessen tried to, but again, looking at some of their choices, I think that's a complicated position to be in.
Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree. And a lot of this feels structural. I mean, you go back to Web 1, right? Like Enron. I just watched the documentary last week, and it was eerie how many of the same issues reared their head around governance, around conflicts of interest, around greed, around lack of transparency, fraud incentives. And every time these things happen, people are shocked and outraged. Happened more recently with SPACs. And to me, it's just a perennial, like human issue that's hard to avoid around greed. And I think regardless of the technologies we're using, people find ways to get around constraints, to kind of find opportunities for arbitrage. That to me is one of the arguments behind better, more thoughtful regulation, right? It's around bringing people into the room to think about safeguards. Even in the most current implosion of FTX and these others, I think a lot of people were surprised that these weren't banks that were backed by the FDIC, right? And so there are controls and safeguards and safety nets that I think society is responsible for putting in place, and that the market often doesn't have the same onus of thinking about or suggesting. That's okay. So to me, I think sometimes it's almost like it's misleading to focus on Web3 as as either the problem or the solution. It's a set of tools that can be used for good or for bad. And it's more on us to think about what we're trying to solve for as a society.
Without putting you on the spot, Ed, and you, from what I know, you weren't involved in any of these meltdowns, but what has been happening from a consumer point of view recently is there's investors who've been playing around with founders with money that isn't their own, and mostly now the founders using everyone's money, like retail investors' money, to ultimately make themselves richer and further causes that were in their interest for whatever reason, be it political or not. How are we going to prevent that, and what role should the investors play there going forward in terms of, that's what I work on, right? I think VCs need to be much more in focus because they have an enormous amount of power. And yeah, sometimes the pendulum swings towards the founders, but the WeWork board from moment B upwards was dominated by investors, and it took them years to do something about this guy. And they're still not done with him, right? So, without going into that conversation, but so is it regulation? Is there something that the VCs, particularly in a moment when there is no regulation of this space to the extent where the protection happens?
I just want to say one tiny thing. If you look at Adam Newman and SBF, what do they have in common? You know, like, again, if we're pattern matching founders, I think, sorry to interrupt you, but I think some of this does go back to bias in VC and how, not every VC, but in terms of how some funders look at what a good founder looks like. And I think there are so many amazing founders that I work with struggling to raise $500,000 for something incredibly compelling that has real utility, at the same time as Adam Newman is coming home with 70 million for a blockchain carbon company that falls 3 months later. I think the challenge is, because there is no accountability, SBF isn't in jail. Adam Newman has raised loads of money for his third company. I think in some cases we're holding up the wrong stories. It's really interesting to me that Elizabeth Holmes is in prison. I mean, she should be. That's clear medical fraud, let's be clear. And the reason I'm using these analogies is I feel like unless we clearly hold certain behaviors up and say, hey, this is not cool, you know, of course, I understand why the funds that invested in FTX are like, oh, this is the model, we expect some losers. But I also feel like, you know, Hunter Walker wrote a great follow-up piece saying, actually, when you have lots of mom and pop shops that have lost their savings, that's actually not a great response, I think, in general. Like, certainly, I think VC has I think at this moment in time, more funds than ever, you know, I think the largest funds do have, you know, I'm really passionate about funds, you know, I think Atomico yesterday with their State of European Tech report, a whole section around the move to purpose. I think, you know, this is the narrative setting work certain funds can do and should do, I think, in the same way that startups can shape the narrative themselves as well.
I agree with that. But I personally, I mean, I in part entered Web3 a little over 1.5 years ago because I was sort of stuck on what to do in venture, in part because so many of the challenges do feel like very structural. Like, VCs ultimately are accountable to their LPs, which are family offices, sovereign wealth funds, endowments, pensions. And those are massive capital allocators that are searching for alpha, right? And the way you generate alpha often is to chase contrarian outsized bets, right? Which have risk embedded within them. And the way you raise your next fund is to produce returns better than the other VCs out there. And so it does feel like there's some like Ponzi game economics embedded in venture, which are very, very hard to avoid. And the ESG movement of the last few years around firms raising on that often was found to be very, very skin deep, right? Which is frustrating, I think, for a lot of us. But I've struggled with how to get around that. until we think about even just, I think, like the asset class of venture more generally, like, will it always look as it does or look more and more like a mutual fund, right? Like where is the real value being created there?
I just also think we have to say out loud, why is it contrarian? If they're seeking contrarian bets, why aren't they betting on Black women versus another Stanford grad? To me, this is very intriguing when we talk about VCs searching for the alpha. It's always like, but you're backing the same companies time and time and time again.
I also wonder, this is more of a question than really an answer, but to what extent was the alpha just there in the first place because of lack of regulation, right? I mean, was the alpha primarily there because, you know, stuff like FTX could exist, like the alpha going away once we have like proper regulatory regimes in place, or is it creating like new types of alpha? I don't really know. It's probably more for Sarah and Ed to answer.
Yeah, this VC conversation is obviously ongoing, and that's also what I'm writing a lot about at the moment. What the systems of VC does and how that's changing and how that might need to change further. I want to jump to the E and back to Slobodan. There's lots, and this is an ongoing critique, especially, and I make this very, very clear, of Bitcoin and very particular type of cryptocurrencies, partly because Ether just got out of the pressure through the merge. When it comes to the environmental footprint, just to give you people who are listening one or two comparisons, the carbon footprint of Bitcoin is supposed to be as high as the carbon footprint of a country like Sweden or Argentina, or the equivalent of beef or natural gas equivalent relative to its market value. This has also moved 60 times higher in the last 5 years. From a perspective of outcome, and this is just Bitcoin, right? Doing good in the world, this is absolutely unjustifiable. There's absolutely no reason why we would have what is nothing really more than a speculative asset at the moment to do this to our environment if we take seriously that we're in a climate crisis. So what is happening in that world when it comes to the environmental impact, and you can happily go beyond carbon here, Slobodan, and is there possibly, and this is an open invitation for everyone else to join as well, a role for Web3 more generally to play in helping us tackle this all?
Yeah, I think we probably have seen like a bit of the last 1 or 2 years, I would say, probably maybe call me.
Your sound is somehow cutting out, Slobodan, weirdly.
Oh, sorry. Is it now better?
A bit better, yeah.
Okay. I think what we've kind of seen with Ethereum this year with the merge is essentially like just a culmination of a longer development. I think that they shifted to proof of stake in itself was like a great accomplishment because it's, you know, from an engineering perspective, quite difficult to change like the engines on a plane mid-flight. And it reduced like the energy consumption by, I think, more than 99%. So this is amazing. I mean, but frankly speaking, other blockchains started with proof of stake from the beginning and were quite successful with that. And I think this is like the model going forward. And I think what we, or maybe what I hope we can shift more towards to is to go away from this, hey, how can we reduce the harm done by blockchain, towards, hey, how can we actually use blockchain for something that does something good, right? And this is, I think, where, you know, the work that, for example, the Climate Collective does that Ed mentioned comes into play, to really like utilize this technology to improve, like, for example, carbon markets, right? I mean, it would be quite exciting if blockchain can, for example, reduce the costs for MRV, for efficient MRV in carbon markets, because this would unlock a lot of like climate action in that space. And I think this is like this should be kind of the goal here, and not to like try to reduce the energy consumption of the system in itself, which I would agree with what you said is unjustifiable to some extent, especially if you have alternatives available.
I have 3 points to make on this, if that's okay. And so I think it's a good question, right? We always need to be evaluating what it is that we are spending energy on. And I would say in general, everything takes energy, and we're not always looking at that. Our traditional banking system takes energy, our internet takes energy. So it's interesting that this question in terms of blockchain and Bitcoin really elevates it. And I think it's an opportunity to address it. So the first point is, I think the energy consumption of blockchains, they're not all equal. It's not all Bitcoin. Part of what we're doing at the Sustainability Coalition right now, the research is, how can we come up with a shared methodology so that you can really understand what the energy consumption is across different blockchains? I think that's going to be useful. The second is, I think we also see some really interesting innovation around green energy in this space. Not to say that it, the question still isn't valid. It absolutely is. But you can see some projects like Hive blockchain, which is in northern Sweden. There is excess hydro energy that would otherwise go to waste. They use that to power Bitcoin mining, and then the byproduct of the data center, that heat, they use to pump into greenhouses and have agriculture. So we can think really thoughtfully about how we're using energy, and that's not specific to Bitcoin. That is, we can think about that in all data centers that we're using. And then the third point is, I'm not sure that Bitcoin has no other use other than speculation. And what comes to mind to me is the Chiva app that is used by El Salvadorians to send money cross-border into El Salvador and within El Salvador. A neighbor in Oakland, California showed this to me, and it's a really great product, right? That enables cross-border transfers of value very quickly and then into bank accounts in El Salvador. And that is on the Bitcoin blockchain. It's a side chain, but still, like, there's usability here that I think is really important to elevate. So those are my 3 points, I would think.
Does anyone want to jump into the E before we're going to the S?
All I'd say is it's a really interesting topic that we're seeing more and more enthusiasm around. Like at its core, climate could probably be reduced to like a coordination problem, and Web3 is a great coordination tool. And so a lot of the innovations that we've seen at Climate Collective and that I've seen through Allegory involve thinking about new ways to align incentives in things like carbon markets and leverage all of the features of Web3, like decentralization, transparency, to make these markets more efficient, not to solve them, but to make them better.
Yeah, I think we can agree on the potential of Web3 to be used to help us. And that's why it's great for you both, Ed, Slobodan, and to an extent, Brindley, with your work as well, that you're working in that direction. Picking up the S point, and I'll look at you, Sarah, for obvious reasons, with a first answer. Taking what we've just discussed as well, Web3 could be a new way of doing the internet, but also doing all kinds of democratic processes better, more transparent, more easily accessible and visible for the participants. And I'll just point out that 2 issues that are going back, and both of those to 2 of the questions that Amy has raised in the chat as well. What we've really been seeing is that the society, if I think of this out, has been quite harmed by what happened, in particular recently in the last 18 months. Lots of people's money have been burned. And we briefly talked about the education piece. In the absence of the protection, the regulated protection of these people, should it really be on to the people themselves to educate themselves? As in, should I know everything about FTX and make sure that I understand their structure better than the investors at least pretended to? So where does this start and where does this stop would be one point. And then the second, perhaps, the last question here in the chat, you talked about marginalized founders and how big of an issue that is in Web2. We know, are you seeing potential, and I'm very explicitly giving this a hopeful twist, in Web3 where there is more space for people of color or women, because the stereotype is it's even worse?
Well, I think I want to start with the education piece, right? To me, it feels insufficient that we say retail investors should know everything. Like, I'm just thinking of a friend who sent me a link to Sailor Moon last year. And I was like, I'm not a trader. I don't really buy coins. I invest in companies because I want to work with the founder over time. So I think firstly, very clearly, the onus should not be on the retail. And the onus should be partly on government in terms of limitations, but also partly on companies. And I think let's be really clear about that. I think secondly, when you think about society, there's a couple of levels to that. You know, there's the speculative, occasional hobbyist buyer or participator that has light understanding, where we need to work as a community of folks building in this space to push for smoother UX, more clarity of thinking, more clarity of risk, etc. But then when I think about society, I also think about the interlacing DAO communities that I'm in. You know, the DAO world is still not that big. Loads of us talk to each other, like there are very interlocking scenes. And what I would say about the community at that level is, you know, very often, I'm just thinking of one project that I did last year. I wrote a public goods starter pack with 4 other people, all of whom use pseudonyms on the internet. Like, it reminded me of my 90s internet. You know, I grew up with a developer dad and I was on the internet very young, in a way that probably now, you know, 10-year-old in a forum with lots of 30-year-olds, you don't know, you know, you're meeting people where they are. You're not learning personal information. You have no idea what their day job is, which I personally find very delightful. So, you know, I worked on this starter pack last year and we had a couple of video off calls to work on it. And at the end, I found out my core contributor is a middle school classics teacher in Michigan, who's a Black woman. And again, I personally find the DAO level society quite diverse. I think the challenge is when you think about founders that raise significant VC, it tends to very often be the same profiles. And there's myriad reasons there. I think firstly, the network and the story to go out and raise significant funding still tends to coalesce around certain factors in a way that we think I still find incredibly unfair. You know, I do think that there are still fewer diverse VCs and angels in the Web3 space compared to Web2. Thinking about my network in Europe particularly, I think I'm the only woman that I know over 40 who invests in this space. Like, it's still, the scene needs more diversification in general. And I think, you know, I think there are lots of communities working to bring in all kinds of, I think Seed Club as an accelerator does an amazing job of this. They attract a very diverse group. I think there are all kinds of communities, but again, you know, we're still seeing the bumper rounds. And if we're thinking about rounds as the proxy for media attention, capital to build things, space to hire, space to run, we're still seeing the largest rounds go to a particular kind of founder. And I think that rests on the bias of networks, the bias of how we interpret stories. I will let someone smarter than me on the panel talk through that. But I both think there is opportunity, but I also think the current downturn means a few things happening at once. I think investors are retreating back to their core networks. And if investors are not themselves diverse, their networks won't be. I think a lot of the folks that came into the space last year are leaving partly because of, you know, maybe they have lack of belief in the space, maybe they've lost money and been burnt. You know, you tend to find the folks that have more freedom will stay. And by freedom, I mean financial and economic freedom. And those tend to be certain profiles. So I think there's a lot of space for optimism, but also a couple of particular, you know, we have to be realistic about where the scene is now and where it can go.
Anyone else want to jump in? Otherwise, I'll open up for a round of hopeful outlooks. I wrote my very first piece about Bitcoin in 2013, when there wasn't really anything else. At least I didn't know about anything else. And I've been very enthusiastic since in terms of the potential that even just Bitcoin has to help people with what you talked about, Brindy, sending money that people who normally don't have access to the type of banking infrastructure that we have easily. And in a bigger, stepping back to a slightly more abstract level, what we're currently seeing, this phase of speculation and burning and people losing money is quite normal in lots of innovation cycles. That comes at one point. So we have to go through this according to the metaphor of stepwise decentralization. We're working in this very young space, which I think all of you have emphasized again today. We're working slowly out what better UX looks like, what better applications, what better decentralization looks like. And what are your hopes of the issues that we can actually tackle with Web3, crypto, the blockchain over the next decade or so? And what will we need for this to happen? Perhaps we do a round to finish this conversation, being careful of the time now, starting perhaps with Ed, and you hand over to each other.
Yeah. It's funny. It's easy to feel very cynical and kind of defeated after this last cycle about what Web3 can do and how fast it can do it. But I still feel very idealistic and optimistic about where we can go. To me, everything that we've seen happen over the last 15-year kind of boom period represents both the promise and the perils of our capitalist system. And I think we need to develop new tools that allow us to create the world we all want to live in. And our current system doesn't do that. So to me, I'm really excited to see a lot of kind of the marketing schemes kind of fall away and the real utility of Web3 left for people excited about solutions to build things with. So I've been focusing, for example, on things like digital MRV, like how can we create decentralized mechanisms to verify environmental assets.
And what does MRV mean, please?
I'm sorry, measurement, reporting, verification. So ways to think about creating higher quality supply of carbon credits and other assets that we can then finance upstream with project developers. I think there's a lot of stuff we can do that realigns our financial system with the things that we care about as society. And to me, like real utility grounded in real assets is how Web3 survives this next cycle. And that's fantastic. It's like a lifeline to the next kind of curve up.
The next world.
The next world, whatever it is.
Yeah, I'm really passionate about fractional ownership, whether it's an alternative to Uber that's owned by the drivers or paying creators fairly. To me, the level of inequality in most of the Western world, well, most of the world feels unsustainable, unfair. Moving back from San Francisco to London last year, I had this very strong realization living in California that I personally could not live in a system that felt so incredibly unequal, and the UK is trending in the same way. So I think the ability of Web3 to not only democratize access, but also to share ownership feels incredibly compelling. And that can work in a number of verticals and in a number of sectors. But I think my biggest hope for the sector is that we stop talking about what can be and we start making it so. And we stop putting all of our funding into centralized billionaires that turn out to be frauds. I think that feels like a clear unlock to me in terms of the scene.
Bobo, go ahead.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I think for me, especially in like next year and probably maybe even the next 2 years, are a lot about like restoring trust in the industry. And I think we'll probably work in two ways. One is probably through regulation, which makes sense in a lot of areas of that space from my perspective. And the other way is more from a probably tech perspective, to really provide like decentralized systems that are more transparent, that just exclude by design certain governance problems that we've seen over the last year. My only concern with this is that I think the two are a bit mutually exclusive and kind of go against each other. A regulator will always try to have an entity to regulate. That's the natural thing, right? So how can we square this? How can you have like those decentralized services, decentralized organizations, and how can you translate this into a world where you have a legal framework essentially?
I think those are great questions. On the optimistic side, I think starting with where we are, our climate situation is quite dire. And I think this is a moment where we need all ideas and we need to unlock the possibility of where the ideas come from. And it's not just in Silicon Valley, and it's not just in New York, and it's not just in London, right? I mean, we need ideas everywhere, and we need action everywhere. And I think on the bright side, what Web3 makes possible is this idea that with this shared infrastructure, you can have access and you can build and you can try out new things. And that to me is, it's where the space is especially dynamic and interesting, and I think is optimistic in many ways. And it's the part of Web3 that I really love engaging with, that optimism.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for these hopeful outlooks. I think what I would like to conclude with is an understanding that the Web3 that we've been dealing with isn't necessarily actually the Web3 that is the potential that we could be having. The decentralization aspect in particular, which I think we discussed as the cornerstone of what Web3 should be built on, isn't developed yet. We're learning, Sarah, I think you call it, we're starting to build our muscle on how that could look like and where it works and where it doesn't work. And some of the problems that we've been seeing, including the big implosions and explosions over the last 18 months, are partly based on the fact that this is not, these pieces have not been built on these cornerstones. So the ESG issues were, in a sense, teething problems that hopefully, with a development in a direction where we've been imagining Web3 going or already being, will be resolved in a reasonably easy way. At least there's lots of potential in these technologies and in the ideologies behind them. And I'm very happy that you're all working on this for all four of you. And thank you very, very much for your insights and ideas today. We're going to be kicking off a research project, so we'll be in touch again with you, but also everyone else here on the chat and in the call to get your input on what are the questions that investors should be asking when they're making Web3 investments when it comes to these safeguarding issues around ESG in the absence or then possibly already in the presence of regulation. So hopefully everyone took something away from today, and thank you very much, everyone, for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.